Texas, December 1944. The morning sun crept slowly over the plains, painting the sky with soft amber light. Inside a wooden mess hall surrounded by barbed wire, the smell of sizzling bacon rolled through the air like an invisible tide. For a moment, even the guards stopped talking. German prisoners shuffled into line. Men in worn Wehrmacht jackets, boots scuffed from the march, eyes hollow from war and disbelief. They had expected punishment. They had expected hunger. What they hadn't expected was the sound of laughter coming from an American cook wearing a sweat-stained cowboy hat, humming a country tune as he flipped eggs on an iron griddle. Karl Weiss, a 23-year-old panzer mechanic from Dresden, stood frozen at the serving counter. The cook grinned at him. "Morning, partner," he said, sliding a plate across the counter. On it lay scrambled eggs, 2 thick slices of toast, and bacon. Real bacon, golden and crisp, still sizzling. The smell hit Karl like a memory from another life. He stared, unsure if it was a trick. Behind him, the line shuffled forward, boots scraping the wooden floor. "Go on, son," the cook said again, his accent thick with the South. "Ain't no poison in it." Karl took the plate, sat at a long wooden table, and looked down at the food. His hands trembled. The bacon glistened with fat. He hadn't tasted pork in almost 2 years. When he bit into it, the crunch and salt filled his mouth, and something inside him broke. He tried to hide it, but the tears came anyway. Across from him, another prisoner muttered, "It's propaganda." But Karl knew it wasn't. It was real, too real. The taste, the warmth, the kindness. He looked up and saw the cook wink before turning back to his grill. For months, the German soldiers had been told America was a land of brutality, that its soldiers were monsters. But now, sitting in a Texas mess hall, Karl realized the truth was far more dangerous. America didn't just fight with guns, it fought with abundance, with decency, with the power to make a man question everything he'd believed about the world. Outside, the ranch flag flapped lazily in the morning wind. Somewhere beyond the fences, a horse neighed, and the sound mixed with the crackle of bacon grease and the quiet murmur of men eating in silence. In that moment, Karl Weiss understood the war wasn't over yet, but his faith in the Reich had already begun to collapse. Before capture, Karl Weiss had believed every word of the propaganda posters plastered across Dresden's factories and barracks. They showed grotesque caricatures of Americans, fat, soulless merchants driven by greed, enslaving prisoners, and burning Europe for profit. He had heard Nazi officers describe US soldiers as cowards who hid behind machines and rations too weak to fight man-to-man. On the Eastern Front, he'd seen hunger turn men into ghosts. The Wehrmacht rations were thin, black bread, watery soup, a scrap of sausage once a week if they were lucky. And so, when Karl and his unit were surrounded in France and captured by the Americans, he expected the same, or worse. He imagined a punishment fitting for the Reich's enemies, starvation, cruelty, humiliation. But nothing in his training prepared him for Texas. When the ship docked in New York, the prisoners were silent, staring through the rails as the Statue of Liberty glimmered in the distance. They were marched through stations where smiling American nurses handed out blankets and water. The guards spoke to them politely, even saying, "Please." It was disarming. Now, in the wide-open plains of central Texas, Karl felt the contradictions deepen. The camp was fenced, yes, but the guards joked freely. The prisoners worked in the fields under the sun, earning small wages to buy cigarettes, postcards, even harmonicas. At night, the guards played swing music over the loudspeakers, music the Nazis had called degenerate. Yet, it lifted the men's spirits in ways the Reich never could. Still, many of the German officers clung to the myth of America, the monster. They told the others not to be fooled, that this comfort was a weapon, a trick to break their discipline. "They want to soften you," one sergeant hissed during roll call. "Remember your oath, remember who you are," but even the most loyal among them couldn't ignore the facts. The food was plentiful. The guards treated them fairly. They received medical care and books to read. One prisoner, a teacher from Munich, whispered to Karl one night, "If this is captivity, what do you call what we left behind?" That question lingered long after lights out. The next morning, Karl awoke to the familiar smell of bacon again. He lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, thinking of the difference between the America and Gerbil's speeches and the one serving him breakfast. One was a monster, the other a mirror reflecting a truth too powerful for propaganda to erase. And as the camp bell rang for work detail, Karl began to suspect that this quiet, orderly land, where even prisoners were treated with dignity, might be the most dangerous enemy the Reich had ever faced. It began in the grey ruins of Normandy, where Karl Weiss and hundreds of other German soldiers were rounded up by American infantry after the collapse of the front. Their uniforms were filthy, their weapons discarded, their pride shattered. The Americans gave them rations, real food, canned meat, bread, and even coffee, and then herded them aboard trucks bound for the coast. Karl remembered staring out the truck's window at villages reduced to ash. The people, French, Belgian, Dutch, didn't look at the prisoners with fear or hatred. They looked with exhaustion, as if the war itself had consumed their souls. For the first time, Karl felt the weight of what Germany had done. They were loaded onto Liberty ships, massive steel vessels built faster than Germany could sink them. Inside the ship's hold, the air was damp and salty. The piers were guarded by American sailors who treated them not as animals but as soldiers who had simply lost. Karl overheard one sailor joke, "Don't worry, boys, you're heading somewhere warm." When the ship reached New York Harbor, the men pressed against the rails. What they saw defied everything they had been told. A skyline of steel and glass untouched by war. No ruins, no craters, no hunger. The harbor bustled with ships, cranes, and workers. America was not starving, it was thriving. From there, they were placed on trains that crossed a nation larger than Karl had ever imagined. For days they rolled through endless landscapes, forests, plains, mountains, towns where children waved from porches, and people smiled at the sight of the P-cars. The contrast was unbearable. In Germany, children hid in bunkers. Here they played baseball. At each stop, Karl noted the abundance. Overflowing markets, long trains of grain and meat, rail cars full of machinery. He whispered to another prisoner, "They build faster than we can destroy." The other man only nodded, too stunned to speak. When the train finally entered Texas, the prisoners were struck by the vastness of it. The horizon seemed to stretch forever, dotted with cattle and windmills. Heat shimmered off the rails. The guards joked about the best steaks in the world and ranch breakfasts that could feed an army. Karl thought it was just American boasting until he saw the Messol himself. The camp was simple but clean. Whitewashed barracks, open yards and fields for labor. It didn't feel like a prison. The men were handed fresh uniforms, medical checkups, and clean bunks. Each received a bar of soap and a towel. Even the guards smiled as they passed out plates piled high with food. As Karl sat on his bunk that night, the sound of swing music drifted through the camp's loudspeakers. The rhythm was strange and alive. He realized he had not heard music since Dresden. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace, and an unsettling thought crept into his mind. Perhaps the Americans didn't need to break Germany. Perhaps they only needed to show them how small the Reich had really been. The truth of America's power didn't come in speeches or threats. It came in numbers, quiet, relentless, impossible to deny. Karl Weiss began to understand it the way a mechanic understands machinery, by counting the parts and realizing how everything fits. The camp clerk, an older sergeant named Miller, liked to talk while handing out work assignments. One morning he leaned against the doorframe of the barracks and said casually, "You boys know there are about 425,000 German prisoners here in the States, 50,000 of them right here in Texas." His words hung in the air. Karl blinked. That was the size of an entire German army group. Later, Karl learned that the US had built more than 70 branch camps across Texas alone, each self-sufficient, each supplied daily with food, fuel, and medicine. It was industrial organization applied to humanity itself. The prisoners were issued 3 full meals a day, sometimes totaling over 3,000 calories, nearly double what a German soldier at the front received by 1944. The Geneva Convention required decent treatment. America went beyond it. Each P received about $15 to $50 worth of food per day, cheaper than feeding a US soldier, but with better balance. Bread, meat, milk, eggs, vegetables. Even coffee was served strong and black. For the Americans, feeding enemies wasn't just compassion, it was strategy. Healthy men worked better. Healthy men talked. Healthy men went home with new ideas. Carl noticed the precision everywhere. Trucks rolled into camp every morning, unloading supplies on schedule, every box labeled and inventoried. The cookhouse logs were kept like bank records. Pounds of flour, gallons of milk, ounces of bacon grease. Nothing wasted, nothing missing. It was logistics as art. By contrast, Carl remembered the chaos of German supply lines, the surging, the hunger, the broken trains, the warehouses bombed before they could unload. The Reich had tried to conquer the world with willpower. America was doing it with spreadsheets. Even the smallest things spoke volumes. The camp had a library, hundreds of books in both English and German. There were classes for mechanics, carpentry, and English. The Americans encouraged learning, not just labor. "You can't hate a man who teaches you how to build," one prisoner whispered during class at night when the guards switched on the floodlights. Carl looked across the camp and saw dozens of other prisoners reading, studying, or writing letters by lamplight. It was a different kind of army, an army of thought. The next week, Carl overheard an American officer explaining the war production figures to a visitor. "We built 96,000 planes last year, 49,000 tanks, and more trucks than the rest of the world combined." The man said, "Our factories are the front line." Carl turned the numbers over in his mind, feeling them like bullets in his hand. The war had never been fair. Germany had tried to fight an idea with ideology, and the math of that war was already lost. The first time Carl Weiss saw a Texas ranch, he thought it was another world. The camp's work detail had been assigned to help local ranchers during harvest and cattle season. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks at sunrise, escorted by 2 guards who carried rifles but rarely needed them. The air smelled of hay, leather, and morning dew, a scent Carl would never forget. The ranch stretched farther than the eye could see. Fences ran like threads across the land, and cattle dotted the horizon like moving shadows. The owner, a broad-shouldered man in a straw hat named Jack Dempsey, no relation to the boxer, he joked, greeted the prisoners with a grin. "Boys, I don't care what uniform you wore. You work hard, you eat well. That's the deal." For men who had spent months behind barbed wire, the open land felt like freedom itself. The prisoners fixed fences, dug irrigation ditches, and helped round up cattle. Their hands blistered at first, soft from confinement, but soon the work became its own reward. Out here, the lines between guard and captive blurred. During lunch breaks, Jack's wife brought out sandwiches, coffee, and sometimes cold Coca-Cola bottles. The glass sweating in the heat. Carl had never tasted it before. The first sip was electric, sweet, sharp, alive. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You like it?" Jack chuckled. "We call it the taste of America. The men worked hard because they were treated like men. They were paid 80 cents a day, part of it in camp script they could spend on cigarettes, paper, or candy. In the evenings they rode back to camp tired, but strangely fulfilled. Not beaten or humiliated, just human again." One afternoon, a young cowboy named Tom approached Carl while they were mending a fence. "You ever ride one of these?" he asked, pointing to a chestnut mare. Carl shook his head, laughing nervously. "Not unless you count tanks," Tom grinned. "Well, tanks don't buck." And before Carl could protest, the cowboy handed him the res. The horse shifted beneath him, muscles rippling like coiled steel. Tom kept a steady hand on the bridle, walking beside him. "Easy now, she's got more heart than hate." That simple act, a cowboy teaching a German prisoner to ride, became a story whispered through the camp for weeks. It was absurd, beautiful, and deeply confusing. The enemy wasn't supposed to show kindness. Yet here they were working side by side, breaking bread and sharing jokes. At night, the prisoners sat outside their barracks watching the stars. They talked about home, about wives, about cities turned to rubble, about what they would tell their children someday. And always Carl thought about the ranchers' words. "You work hard, you eat well." It wasn't just food he was being fed, it was dignity. By the time winter came, Carl no longer felt like a prisoner. He felt like a man learning. One meal and one sunrise at a time what freedom really meant. It was late January 1945 when the smell of bacon returned. The war in Europe was nearing its end. though few inside the Texas camps knew how close it was. That morning, frost clung to the barbed wire and the cattle loaded somewhere beyond the fences. The camp loudspeaker crackled to life, calling the men for breakfast. Carl Weiss trudged across the yard with his mess tin in hand, expecting the usual fare: scrambled eggs, oatmeal or biscuits. But as soon as he stepped inside the mess hall, the air hit him. The smell was unmistakable, rich, smoky, alive. Bacon. The cooks, mostly Texans who took pride in their craft, had managed to get a delivery from a nearby meat plant. That day's menu was simple: fried eggs, bread and bacon for every man, PWW or guard alike. When Carl reached the counter, he found the same cowboy cook as months before, sleeves rolled up, grease popping around him. "Morning, Fritz," the man said with a half grin. "Guess it's about time you boys had yourselves a proper breakfast again." Carl nodded silently. The cook scooped a few sizzling strips onto his plate. They gleamed like gold in the light. Around him, men murmured in disbelief. Some even laughed softly, not mockery, but relief. They sat down in silence, rows of once proud soldiers, now just men with plates before them. And when Carl bit into that first piece, the taste hit him like memory and revelation. It was the same as before, crisp, salty, perfect. But it no longer felt like mockery. This time it felt like forgiveness. One prisoner whispered, "Do you think they're mocking us?" Another replied, "No, I think they just don't hate us." As the meal went on, something changed in the air. The guards and the prisoners began to talk, small things at first about weather, work, baseball. A few even laughed together. Carl caught sight of one guard showing photos of his family to a German sergeant. The sergeant nodded, smiling faintly, then took out a worn photo of his own wife. Two enemies bound by the same ache. When breakfast ended, the prisoners lingered, not wanting to leave the warmth or the smell. Carl looked around and saw faces softened by something unfamiliar. Peace. Later that day, while working on the ranch, Carl told the cowboy who taught him to ride, "Back home, we were told you were beasts." The cowboy shrugged. "You heard wrong, friend. We just work hard and like our bacon." It was such a simple answer, almost absurd, but it shattered years of indoctrination more effectively than any lecture could. That night, Carl wrote in his diary, "This morning I ate bacon and saw America. They do not conquer with fear, they conquer with breakfast." It was half a joke, half a confession. But in the quiet light of that Texas morning, surrounded by kindness he couldn't understand, Carl Weiss had already begun to surrender in the only way that mattered: inside. By the spring of 1945, the Texas air had grown warm again. Wild flowers spread across the fields outside the camp, and the prisoners' routines carried on as usual: work, meals, reading, and letters home that rarely arrived. But something in the air had changed. Conversations were quieter now, more cautious. Rumors traveled faster than mail. It began one evening in April, when the camp loudspeakers, usually reserved for music, suddenly crackled with static. The prisoners paused mid-supper, spoons in hand, as a deep American voice filled the mess hall. "Berlin is surrounded. Allied troops have crossed the Ila River. The Third Reich is collapsing." No one spoke. Even the guards seemed frozen. The voice continued, calm and factual, describing the fall of cities that had once seemed immortal. Dresden, Leipzig, Hamburg, all gone. Carl Weiss felt his stomach twist. Those weren't just names, they were home. His family lived somewhere near Dresden, or what had been Dresden. His last letter had come months earlier. He closed his eyes, imagining the firestorms, the rubble, the silence that followed. The broadcast ended with an almost cruel normally. Swing music drifting back over the speakers, cheerful and bright. One of the guards turned to his companion and muttered, "Guess it's nearly over." For the prisoners, it wasn't just news, it was revelation. Their world had officially collapsed, and they were hearing it from the voices of their captors. Over the following days, new broadcasts confirmed the unthinkable. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The camp went utterly silent that night. Even the guards spoke in whispers. No shouts, no celebration, just the quiet of an ending that everyone had waited for, and yet no one knew how to face. Carl walked outside into the Texas dusk. The horizon glowed red, not from fire, but from the last light of the setting sun. For a moment he stood there listening to the distant hum of crickets, the sound of peace that didn't belong to him yet. Behind him, the camp's radio played a new broadcast. President Truman's address to the nation. The guns are silent. The cause of freedom has prevailed. Freedom. The words stung. What did freedom mean now when everything he'd believed had burned away? The next morning, the guards assembled the prisoners and told them what they already knew. The war is over. You are no longer enemies. You are guests until transport is arranged. Some of the prisoners cried openly. Others stared blankly, unable to process the words. Carl simply nodded, numb. But when breakfast came, bacon again, as if by ritual, he noticed something different. The guards and prisoners ate together. No lines, no barking orders, just men. All of them tired, all of them trying to find meaning in the wreckage of their worlds. That night, Carl wrote a single line in his notebook. We lost the war the day we thought hatred was strength. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it. But under that Texas sky, he finally understood that surrender wasn't just a military act, it was a moral one. 2 weeks after Germany's surrender, a Red Cross truck arrived at Camp Hearn carrying sacks of mail. For most of the prisoners, it was the first communication from home in nearly half a year. The guards called names from a list, handing out envelopes one by one. The men gathered in silence, each letter a fragile lifeline to a world that might no longer exist. Carl Weiss received 2. The first was from his mother, written in shaky handwriting on thin paper. The second bore the stamp of the German Postal Service, faded, creased, almost illegible. He opened his mother's letter first. My dear Carl, it began, we are alive, Dresden is gone, the sky burned for 2 nights, your sister and I survived by hiding in the cellar. Your father has not come home, but do not worry for us. We have food thanks to American soldiers who brought supplies. Imagine that, Americans feeding Germans. The world has turned upside down. Carl read it twice, then folded the paper carefully, hands trembling. Around him, other prisoners wept quietly or stared at their own letters in disbelief. One man from Hamburg tore his open, read 2 lines, and walked out into the yard, sobbing uncontrollably. The camp chaplain, an American sergeant-turned-preacher, offered to hold a small service for the dead. Even the guards attended. No uniforms mattered that day. They sang softly under the open sky, their voices blending in a strange harmony that neither side could have imagined a year earlier. Later that evening, Carl finally opened the second letter. It was from his old commanding officer, written months earlier in a tone that already felt like another century. Hold fast, it read. The Führer promises new weapons, new victories. The Reich will rise again. You must believe. Carl stared at the words for a long time, then quietly tore the letter in half. The war it spoke of was already a ghost, a dead echo from a world built on lies. The next day he volunteered to help the guards translate. Letters for other prisoners who couldn't read English. It gave him purpose, something that wasn't about fighting or surviving, but understanding. He began to see the Americans not as conquerors, but as translators of a new world. At night, he shared his mother's letter with his closest friend, a quiet Bavarian named Otto. When he finished reading, Otto whispered, "It's strange. We were told they would destroy us, but they saved our families instead." Carl nodded slowly. Maybe this is what winning looks like. Not destroying your enemy, but feeding him. He looked through the barbed wire toward the horizon, where the faint glow of a small Texas town flickered in the distance. Somewhere out there, people were dancing, laughing, and drinking Coca-Cola under neon lights. For the first time, Carl didn't feel envy or hatred. He felt gratitude and a deep, unfamiliar ache for a world where such things were normal. He folded his mother's letter one last time, slipped it under his pillow, and whispered into the dark, "Doña, America." By the summer of 1945, the Texas sun burned hotter, and the camp fences no longer felt like barriers. Everyone knew they were going home soon, at least those who still had homes to return to. The war was over, but what came next was harder to understand. One morning, as the sky turned orange over the prairie, the guards announced something unusual. A farewell breakfast for the boys heading home. One sergeant said, "You've earned a good send-off." The PS gathered in the mess hall, now freshly painted and bright with morning light. The tables were lined with plates of bacon, eggs, biscuits, and steaming coffee. There was even a small American flag on the counter, and next to it, something no one expected, a German one, worn but clean. Carl sat down with Otto and a few others. As the smell of bacon filled the room again, that same smell that had once mocked them, then comforted them, and now it meant goodbye. When the cowboy cook stepped forward, he raised his cup and said, "Boys, I reckon we had our differences, but you all worked hard and kept your word, so let's eat like free men today. Not guards and prisoners, just folks." The room went silent for a moment. Then one man began to clap. Another followed. Soon the hall was full of applause, not for victory or surrender, but for something rarer, respect. The breakfast began, and laughter replaced the sound of boots and orders. Some of the Texans sat with the Germans, swapping stories about farms, families, and the weather back home. A guard passed Carl a cup of real coffee, strong, black, and fragrant. "Not the camp kind," the man said with a wink. "This one's from my wife's kitchen." Carl smiled. "Tell her she makes peace better than generals." As they ate, one of the guards brought out a small radio. A country song crackled through the static. "Don't fence me in." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A few of the PS began to hum along, their accents thick but sincere. When the song ended, the guards switched stations, and a familiar American voice came through. President Truman's announcement of Japan's surrender. The war, all of it, was officially over. The room went completely still. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Carl whispered, "It's done." Otto nodded. "So, what do we do now?" Carl looked around at the smiling Texans, the open door, the sunlight spilling in. "We live," he said simply. After breakfast, the prisoners were told they could take one small keepsake before departure. Carl approached the cowboy cook and asked for something simple, a strip of the red and white checkered tablecloth. The man tore a piece and handed it to him. "Something to remember Texas by," he said. Carl folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. "I won't forget," he said quietly. As they boarded the trucks that would take them to the train station, the guards tipped their hats. Some even shook hands. Carl turned back one last time. The sun was high, the camp behind him, quiet, peaceful. He realized that somewhere between capture and breakfast, between fear and forgiveness, he had found something no victory could give. Dignity. The train that carried the German prisoners eastward rumbled through endless stretches of the American heartland. Fields rolled past, green, golden, alive. For men who had spent years surrounded by wire and watchtowers, the open countryside looked impossibly vast, impossibly free. Carl Weiss sat by the window, his hands resting on the wooden ledge, watching the horizon blur. In his jacket pocket, the folded piece of red and white tablecloth felt heavier than cloth had any right to be. The guard walking the aisle wasn't armed. He carried a tin pot of coffee instead, offering refills to men who had once been his enemies. When he reached Carl's seat, he poured him a cup and said, "You'll be home soon, friend." Carl looked up and managed a faint smile. If home still exists. The guard paused, then said softly, "Then build a new one." That night, as the train stopped near the port in New York, the prisoners were given paper, envelopes, and pens. "Write to your families," the camp officer said. "Tell them you're coming." Carl stared at the blank page for a long time. The words wouldn't come easily, not after all he'd seen, not after everything that had been lost. But slowly he began to write. "Dear Mother, the war is over. I am alive. Soon I will see you again." America was not what we were told. It is not full of monsters, but of people, farmers, cooks, and soldiers who treated us better than we deserved. They fed us when we would have starved. They gave us work when we thought we were worthless. And when the war ended, they gave us breakfast, real breakfast, bacon, eggs, and coffee. But it wasn't the food that broke us, it was the kindness. I have learned something here. Something I wish we had learned years ago. Power is not in hate or fear. It is in generosity. The Americans didn't just defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with abundance, with the belief that life should be lived, not sacrificed. Do not worry for me. I will return not as a soldier, but as a man who understands peace. He stopped there, his pen trembling slightly. Then he signed his name and sealed the letter. The next morning, they boarded the Liberty ship that would take them across the Atlantic. As the vessel pulled away from the dock, the men gathered at the rail, watching the Statue of Liberty fade into the mist. Otto turned to Karl and said, "Strange, isn't it? We came here as prisoners and leave as witnesses." Karl nodded. "Maybe that's what freedom really means, seeing your enemy's humanity." As the coastline disappeared behind them, he took out the piece of tablecloth again. The wind caught it, flapping gently in the salt air like a tiny flag. Red and white, the colors of both surrender and hope. He tucked it back into his pocket, closed his eyes and whispered, "Goodbye, Texas." The ship sailed east, carrying hundreds of men who had entered America as soldiers of a fallen empire and were leaving as men reborn. Men who had learned in the most unexpected place that mercy can break harder than any bullet. And somewhere in Texas, a cowboy poured himself another cup of coffee, looked toward the horizon, and said quietly, "Those boys will be all."